written and performed by artist Martin Luther McCoy and recorded with the City Church of San Francisco. Our goal tonight is unique and incredibly special. It's to share personal and authentic reflections on the book based on an Indian, German, and Black lived experience in our community. Moving from our heads to our hearts and bodies. Discussing these things can be triggering for both panelist and listener. Our panelists are brave to share their stories without judgment. Please receive them that way. Notice how your own body feels during this conversation and just let it be what it is. This is part of the work that we all need to do to work towards wholeness and change. We will open up for about 15 minutes for reflections or questions at 8 o'clock if you have time to stay with us. During the conversation, we ask that you listen and hold your ideas until 8. Thank you. I'm going to briefly introduce our panelists for this evening and with so much gratitude for their participation. Kanan Sheth is a local Larchmont Mamaroneck resident, soon to be from New Rochelle. She grew up in Delaware, but was born in India. She is a lawyer, a mother of 2 active boys, and an activist. She's on the board and the treasurer of CURE. Shane Osinloye is a social entrepreneur and managing director of Singularity, a New York-based management consulting and digital property development firm. As a member of multiple community groups, Mr. Osinloye realized these organizations needed corporate best practices to become sustainable. He designed his nonprofit, Urban Legacy, to do what he loves, leveraging and empowering social vision and prudent corporate strategy, converting activism from a lifestyle into a livelihood. Rhiannon Navin grew up in Bremen, Germany. Her career in advertising brought her to the US, where she worked for several large agencies before becoming a full-time mother, writer, and activist. She is the author of Only Child, a best-selling novel that has been translated into 20 languages, a vice chair of the Westchester Democratic Party, and the lead of New Rochelle Indivisible Westchester's election team. This is a group of extraordinary individuals who have personal stories to share, and we are grateful that you came to join to hear them. We will have a question and response format, and all of our panelists are deeply engaged. So we're going to start with Shane, and for all of our panelists, ask the question of, describe your personal connection to CASTE, why you're here and in this conversation.
I'm starting, the pressure is on. My personal connection with CASTE in Black America. I am a Black male. I have grown up around Black women as well, and we share this experience of being trained or it being normalized for us to be looked down on. I want to say every time we walk out of our doors, but sometimes it comes into our homes as well. My relationship with CASTE started when I was a child. Imagine being born into a disadvantaged community. Imagine being born with from a very hardworking family who is navigating a system that's foreign to them, because I'm actually, on my mother's side, first generation American. On my father's side, they descended from the atrocity that was slavery. Imagine going into a elementary school where we are corralled from the time we are in 2nd grade, with people making decisions over us that will determine the rest of our lives. There's a reason why the 3rd grade test scores determine how many prison beds are going to be placed in prisons, all prisons, not just the private ones. Imagine growing up watching your friends disappear as they become justice involved. Imagine every action you take being held against you and the consequences of it being held against you for the entire the entirety of your education. Imagine that everybody that is supposed to defend you in life, your teachers, your principals, the policemen that you walk home and see on the streets, imagine that you can't run to those people because you're afraid of how they're going to compound whatever problem you have. I've actually had a friend that described his experience with the police as being like bees. If you keep really still, maybe they'll go away. That's a quote. That was just my childhood. And I was a pretty good student. And I actually come from a lower middle class Black family. So I could only imagine what my friends who were less well off, less okay in life, as far as their livelihoods, I can't imagine what they were going through. And then bring that into adulthood. Imagine half of the things that you learned in school, you find out they are actually statistical or historical lies. We're all experiencing that right now. And imagine the consequences of those lies determining your livelihood until the day you die, which on average will be earlier than your peers. So my experience with CASTE literally is my life experience.
Thank you, Shane. Kanan, do you want to respond to your personal connection with CASTE while you're here in this conversation?
Yes, thanks, Stacy. When Nicole reached out to me when we were going to have this event with Isabel Wilkerson, I was very nervous about speaking in a forum like this and then talking about my views on reading the book. And one of Cure's mottos is talking about race and racism is uncomfortable, so let's talk. And so I decided to put on my big girl pants and agree to having this talk. But reading this as an Indian American, one of the things that really kind of changed my view is I never really associated India's caste system with the United States and with slavery and Jim Crow until I started reading the book. And then even more, I had to start understanding the fact that I knew so little about the caste system in India. So just to give a bit of background to our audience, India is a massive country with many, many, many religions. About 79% of India is made up of Hindus, and the way the caste system is split up in the book and how they come up with the various castes comes from Hinduism. However, from reading the book and then studying about the caste system on my own since then, I've learned that there's forms of the caste system that has trickled down into all the other religions like Jainism, Sikhism, Christianity, Islam, that I don't think most Indians were even aware of. And then the other thing that I found interesting was that while India is about 79% Hindu, in the United States, according to 2012, so I apologize that my data is quite old, but only 51% of Indians in America are actually Hindu. But if we were to extrapolate what makes up the Indians in America, over 91% of them would be considered a higher caste. And that's simply because opportunity, money, education, the ability to come to America. And so studying all that and learning about that, there's just information I myself as an Indian American was not aware of. On a personal level, the two things that kind of resonated with me, that kind of brought back some memories of my childhood when reading the book about caste is, one was we didn't talk about it at home. It's not something that was discussed, but yet there were parts of the caste system that plays into my home environment. And the second was, I had an Indian boyfriend in college who was Brahmin. And when we were dating, he actually told me, he's like, I'm a Brahmin. And I was like, oh yeah, well, I'm an untouchable, which was a flippant comment, but I was very annoyed that he wanted to tell me his caste as if it had some power. But then a few months later, we were at a restaurant in Delaware, and my college boyfriend is darker than I am. And so when we were at the restaurant, he said that people were staring at us. And I told him, I was like, no, I think that's in your head. I don't see anyone staring at us. And he said, well, that's easy for you to say because you fit in more than I do. And so I think just here's someone who's telling me he's of the highest caste and then immediately felt like a lower caste person. And so that reading that book triggered some of those memories of just how the two kind of play both in India and then in the US.
Thank you, Kanan. Rhiannon, can you describe your personal connection to CASTE?
Yes. I am here and in this conversation because I'm joking, as Kanan made me do it. Kanan and I first met when at the first Women's March in January 2017, the day after Donald Trump was inaugurated president. And we boarded the buses at the Larchmont train station with many that I see.
That's the last of the cure stuff of the
and it was 4 o'clock in the
Yes.
morning.
Sorry, Rhiannon. Can I just remind the attendees to mute themselves so we can
This
hear our
is the
panelists?
discussion that's
but you didn't tell me.
Thank you.
We boarded the buses at 4 o'clock in the morning in the freezing cold and in the dark at the Larchmont train station, and we were all strangers to each other, and we were all equally shell-shocked about what was happening in this country and in my adopted country, because as you said earlier, I was born and raised in Germany. And at some point during this march, Kanan walked up to me and in her, that usual frank way that we all love about her, said, "So, you're wealthy looking, you're blonde, you have blue eyes. Why are you marching today?" And I told her then what I'm going to speak a little bit about today, which is I am from Germany and I am the granddaughter of Nazis. I've always been very frank and very open about my family's past ever since I moved here at the age of 24, although it's obviously difficult to face and difficult to acknowledge and nerve-wracking for me to speak about, especially in this setting, where I'm hearing about the consequences of lower caste members. So as a member of the perceived upper caste, this is a very guilt-ridden, shame-ridden thing to kind of acknowledge. So a little bit about my actual history is that so my mother was born in 1943, so towards the end of the war. And when she was born, her father was actually in Italy at the time. He was there as an interpreter for the German armed forces. And what that means that he was taking part in interrogations of partisans and of American and British prisoners of war. He was part of the interrogations, and these prisoners of war then went on to be executed. In the years before my mother was born, both of my grandparents, my grandfather and my grandmother, were they were translators at the Reichssicherheitsamt, which is the Gestapo headquarters. They were in charge of translating the foreign press, which means that they, long before the general German population, were very aware of what was going on behind the scenes, what was happening to the Jews in Germany at the time. After the war ended, my grandfather was detained as a war criminal by the British forces. But my grandmother actually was able to kind of wiggle her way into working as a translator for the British forces and was able to get my grandfather released after only a year of detainment. So, neither of them ever faced any consequences for their actions or for their complicity. When Kanan and I met in 2017 at this Women's March, I was terrified because I could already see the similarities of Hitler's rise to power and Trump's. And the only thing that I knew for sure at the time was that I was not going to have any of my 3 children ever ask me, what did you do during that time, Mom? When I first heard about Isabel Wilkinson's book, CASTE, I was curious because I had been born and raised in Germany, and education always included the Holocaust as a keystone of the curriculum at every age group. But I had never, when I heard the term caste, for me that was always related to what was going on in India. I never associated it with the Third Reich in Germany, or with the centuries-long suppression and exploitation of African Americans in America. And I never knew that the Nazis actually studied the racial systems in America as to plot the outcasting of the Jews in Germany. So I've been taught over and over again and encouraged in Germany, growing up in Germany, to actively confront my country's collective dark history. And I grew up with a mother who battled her historical burden, that burden of being a daughter of Nazis, her whole life, by consuming every available piece and documentation literature about the Third Reich. I was drawn to CASTE because it offered a new perspective. And my mom is currently reading it and is completely blown away by it as well. I'm going to close by saying that Dietrich Bonhoeffer, that Isabel mentions in her book, who said silence is in the face of evil is itself evil, is something that I have grown up with. The man that she mentions in her first chapter, August Landmesser, the one man in the crowd of Nazis who are saluting and cheering, and he's the only one who's not participating, is somebody that I have known about my entire life. I've seen the picture of him standing in the crowd. I've known him since I was a child. I always thought as a child I would be like him should I ever be in a situation like that. I will be like Sophie Scholl, the student dissident who went on to be executed at age 22, or I would be like the Miep Jan Gies, the incredibly courageous people who hit Anne Frank. Of course, as a child, I was not really aware so much of the extraordinary sacrifice that it would take to be a dissident in a regime like that at the time. So there were many things in CASTE that really spoke to me, and that reaffirmed my experience and my feelings of growing up as as 2 generations removed from the Third Reich, and it really, I connected with a lot of things that she said, and when she quotes this German student in her in chapter 27 that says, "For the generations who come after us, we should be guardians of the truth," is something that I've been feeling very strongly in the last few years, and I've been trying to live by every day.
Okay, I need to just take a very deep breath. If everyone could just join me in taking a very deep breath. It's one thing to learn, about history and experience. It's another to have the courage of all of you to share your personal experience and how intertwined our experiences really are. You've already mentioned this, many of you, but I'm going to ask you again. You've mentioned, and again, I can't understate the bravery that each of you show, not just tonight, but in your lives, to not deny, and I think that's the bravery that we're all challenged with, right? And how to look at ourselves so that we can look outside. And I think sometimes in our activism, sometimes we forget the look at ourselves piece. The next question we wanted to ask you is, we've learned that we all carry an historical burden, every single one of us, because none of us just showed up from Mars. We all come from somewhere, and some people, some of us are more aware of it than others. And we've all been living in a caste system. What does that historical burden, some of you have mentioned it, look like for you now? Shane, I'll go ahead and ask you first.
It's interesting that Israel has been in the news as of late. I promise this relates. Because Israel has a system called conscription, where once you become of age, you have to join the Israeli military because of what's happened to the people of Israel throughout history for thousands of years. Being born into America as a Black male, as a Black person, because Black women go through this too, it feels like conscription into an army you know nothing about. It feels like conscription into a war. It feels like a draft from the time I first opened my eyes. That existence is a burden. It is not a privilege to, we don't have, I don't have the opportunity to live somewhere else or to move somewhere else or to migrate somewhere else, because anti-Blackness, this hierarchy, this caste that we've created, it travels with me to anywhere that Europe is touched. There's no place for me to escape. It's not in the near or distant past. It's right now. It's today. It covers the spectrum of existence. It goes from housing. Everyone loves to blame gun violence in Baltimore and Chicago for every problem that's happening in the Black community. That doesn't explain health disparities. When we attend doctors, that doesn't account for implicit bias found in medical students in their first years, which doesn't dissipate much after their education. It doesn't explain the pay gap from Black people who are equally educated and experienced compared to their white counterparts. It doesn't explain the lack of presence of Black students in STEM programs, even of those who have achieved honors and who qualify for them, where we're represented in the 1 percentile, while other people of color get to experience 30 or 40% of participating in those programs. I could point to any industry, I could point to any walk of life, which is really what that is doing, and show you just how burdened we are. And then on top of all of that, on top of living that experience, very much like the first generation of people that came out of participating in the Holocaust, not as the victims, but of the oppressors, of the actual killers, the murderers, excuse me. There's so many people in this country that just want to brush it aside and pretend, oh, well, slavery is over. Slavery is over. We're still contending voting rights, but slavery is over, so everything is okay. Oh, we still have disparities in housing appraisals and mortgage acquisitions, but everything is okay. We still have disparities in entrepreneurship rates, but everything is okay. No, it's not okay. And that's why so many people on a daily basis are making it their business, because it's very late in the game. It's 2021. So we're making it our business to show everyone exactly how not okay it is. And we're only as strong as the weakest link. And we keep on putting a blowtorch on the weakest links in America. Actually, they're the strongest links. We've just had such an incredible blowtorch on them for the last 400 years that we're starting to feel the pressure of it. So that is my burden of being in a caste system in America, feeling that on a daily basis, going into having to explain it to white people, which is why I'm so proud of you, Stacy. I'm so proud of Nicole. I'm so proud of Rhiannon. I've seen her work in Indivisible. I've seen them try to convert people. I'm past that game. I am not my grandparents' child. I'm not going to spend my Black life, my valuable Black life, converting people into not being racist anymore. I'm burdened with having to navigate that for myself, and even having to represent my people to try to explain that to others who are participating. They're not oblivious to the situation. They're direct beneficiaries, if not complicit participants. So that is the burden, as much as that was.
Again, for me, a deep breath. Thank you. And I just have to respond because Shane, and I'm just
I
going
love
to
you,
say,
Stacy.
what was that?
I love you, Stacy.
I love you, Shane. I mean, through this entire series, you know, we focus on the caste, the non-dominant castes. And I'm just going to say to everybody who's listening that it's the dominant caste time to look at ourselves. It is, we have to work. And I know we all have a story, we all have burdens, but it's time for each of us to look at the fact that whether we know it or not, whether we chose it or not, we have power and we have power to change things. So I'm sorry, I'm the moderator, not the speaker. Kanan, how do you experience the historical burden living in a caste system?
It's always heavy to go after Shane. I'm always like, ugh, I have to take a breath. As the middle caste, according to the book CASTE, you know, the historical burden is interesting because I'm not sure if I brought this up in the beginning, but I'm not a Hindu. I'm a Jain, which is not Hinduism. It's a different religion in India. And so I always thought that caste didn't really apply to me, or any of the burdens that come with caste apply to me. And then then Isabel Wilkerson started talking about the concept of fate and karma. And oh my God, there flashes my whole life of explanation of every single thing that I've seen that didn't have an explanation as to why something has happened to someone else. So why is that woman stuck in that abusive marriage? Oh, that is her karma. Why is that guy stuck in this job? That is his fate. Why do I have to marry so-and-so? That is that person's karma. And it is been used, not just in Hinduism, but I would say within the Indian culture as an explanation as to why things are. And it's really used to subjugate those they want to subjugate. So this idea that Brahmins can tell the Dalits that it is destined by God that you are of this caste, and that in order to not be in this caste, you have to do everything we say, so that by karma, you will come back in your next life form as a higher caste. And it's such a powerful tool to use religion and fate and karma. Because you always hear like people using, oh, that's your karma, but when reading the book, it changes my entire view of, well, I've always kind of had a slightly negative view of fate and karma just because of the explanation always given to me for things that I thought was unjust was it's someone's fate or it's their karma. So I think that's a burden that I think all Indians are going to have to kind of reckon with, because I'm pretty sure if there's an Indian listening into this, they have heard their family member or someone use karma or fate as a reasoning for something that they didn't think was right. And the other thing was the other historical burden, which it's so prevalent within the Indian culture, is who we marry, this obsession that our parents have on who we marry. And it's rarely about the individual. And it's so about the family. Does he come from a good family? And this concept of this good family and not it being the individual makes me wonder how much of it, is really just ingrained in the caste system of, automatically, what's their last name? Oh, from their last name, I can tell what part of India they're from, what their religion is. And this identity to their last name is just so powerful. So I think those are the two things that I think are like, that as Indians in America and Indians in India are going to grapple with, are those two concepts, I think, which keeps kind of the caste system in play, even if by law it was abolished in 1950. And so I think when Dr. Ambedkar, which is he's a Dalit scholar who was the architect of India's constitution, who was also a Dalit himself, he said one of the things that Indians are going to export is this concept on, who we marry. And, it's something that scares me. And then obviously, and how they're exporting this idea of who we marry to keep the caste system, even if it's not in India, it's now in the US. And as we can see, I mean, it's still quite, it's still very prevalent in the US. I didn't know how prevalent. And then the New York Times article that came out 2 days ago with the Hindu temple, and they're bringing in individuals and paying them $1 an hour or $1 a day, and the FBI rating it. And it was because of their caste. It's not necessarily an issue for Indians in India. It's also an issue for Indians in America. And I think that burden is something that Indians in America need to address head on.
Thank you, Kanan. Yeah, perspective that is many of us have not really considered. So thank you. Rhiannon, what does the historical burden look like for you in the caste system?
Historical burden for me in this context is strange to talk about, when I follow Shane and when I follow Kanan, but there is something that looks like a historical burden in my family and in my life as well. In fact, my mother's entire life has been overshadowed by her historical burden. And in many ways it is carried over to my generation, to me and to my sister. There's a quick story from my family that I would like to share, because I think it exemplifies how much a historical burden can become a multi-generational one, and how it can affect families and tear them apart. And even long after the actual traumatic event has concluded, trauma continues to be handed down from generation to generation, and grief and blame and guilt and those emotions in my case, in my family's situation, those are all things that do carry on. So the story that I want to tell is about actually my great-grandparents. So I told you about my grandparents earlier. Now I'm talking about my great-grandparents. So my mother's grandmother, my great-grandmother, the mom of the complicit translator that I talked about earlier, was euthanized by the Nazis. She was mentally ill and she battled depression. Her husband, my great-grandfather, had an affair with the secretary, and my grandmother was inconveniently in the way. When the Nazis rose to power in 1933, it was convenient for him that the mentally ill fell into the category under the Nazi doctrine of worthless human beings. So he had used the opportunity to divorce his wife and have her committed to a psychiatric ward in the town of Schleswig, which is close to where my mother was eventually born, against her will. My great-grandmother spent 10 years in the psychiatric ward where she was, where brutal barbaric treatments were tested out on her, medical experiments and electroshocks, things like that. This all continued until she was transported to Mazarets in Poland, where she then was killed by lethal injections in September of 1944. The official cause of death was heart failure, And the actual date of the death was likely much sooner, because what usually happened was that that patients were killed right after they arrived in Poland, but the date of death was reported to be much later because the daily allowances of the health insurance were still being collected during that time. And then following the patient's murder, the families back in Germany would get really hefty bills for their burials, burials that didn't occur because those patients, after they were murdered, they were buried in mass graves. So my mother's mother, the complicit translator, as I like to call it, herself developed mental illness and depression after the war. And when she divorced my grandfather, or when her Nazi husband left her, I should say, she remarried an abusive man who, during very volatile, violent altercations in their home that happened right in front of my mom when she was a young child, kept using the line on her, "I will have you committed to the same insane asylum as your mother because that's where you belong." He later on then also used that line on my own mother. His prophecy became true when my grandmother ended up in the same psychiatric ward as her mother, also in the town of Schleswig, where she also spent 10 years, just like her mother, and where she stayed until she died. The one interesting tidbit that my mom remembered when I spoke to her about all this, preparing for this call, is that she remembered when she visited her mother in this mental hospital in the years leading up to her death, her mother kept saying, "They're trying to take me to the basement to poison me." This, although she had no way of knowing at the time that that had been her mother's fate. My mother didn't learn about her own parents' complicity in the Nazi regime until she was an adult. She, like I said, her entire life was overshadowed by this revelation that she had when she was a college student. She dealt with her burden by educating herself, by reading anything that was just possibly available to her, as I described earlier. She helped create and ran the Holocaust Museum in the town that I was born and raised in, and interviewed contemporary witnesses. I met many of them when I was a child, and she created many very acclaimed exhibits in this museum. So the shame and the guilt of my mother's life became diluted when it filtered down to my generation. But the shame continues to exist. When I moved to the US, I was kind of very shocked by the very liberal use of or the name call, the Nazi name calling. So this, when I was kind of rigid about my children's bedtime, it's like, "Oh, you're such a bedtime Nazi." That took my breath away. I think that I've always looked for a way to turn this generational historical burden that I carry into something positive and to turn it into positive action. And I think that's leading into the third question. So I'll give it back to Stacy.
Yeah, I don't need to be here. You're just telling, as you all spoke, I think the common thread I heard was this generational propagation of caste, right? And in our time, whether it be through skin color, through the establishment of the United States of America and our economic system, religion, and people, kind of rallying around one another in commonness, economics, ability, status. Caste is about circling around your own, right? Rather than seeing all of humanity as human. And I think our culture, absolutely, and as you guys have described, socially appropriate culture supports the caste system, supports higher and lower and less and more. And as you spoke, no one wins, whether it be, the dominant caste the historical guilt and pain that we're even unaware of. And as we've called, some lower caste and not being permitted to live as human. So I'm sorry, I just felt the need to bring that all together in what I was hearing. And again, to have us to consider each of our own experience, because none of us is outside of the system. I think that's what we learned through Isabel. We all have a place, again, not of our choosing, but we have a responsibility. So the last question is, how do each of you deal with your experience of caste and where today, and where do you find hope? Shane, I'll start with you again.
Isabel Wilkerson was very clear that she wanted to offer a diagnosis of the issue and that she wasn't prepared to present a prescription. The work that I do every day, which is my therapy, which is my catharsis, is to offer that prescription on a daily basis. Not just to again, I'm not here for conversion, not just to the dominant caste who participates in the caste system, in oppression. Caste sounds nice next to oppression. My goal is to empower my people enough to negate the effects of caste. It's incredibly possible and it's incredibly difficult. And I couldn't imagine doing anything else because it would create, I'm not willing to experience the cognitive dissonance that's required to be a Black person and not do something active against caste. And that's what any conformist would have to do. And I'm not slighting conformity because people have families and they're trying to live their lives. That's the issue with caste, is so interruptive. It presents this artificial situation that we have to do something about because the consequences will literally mean our lives. My goal is to make Black empowerment a livelihood, make it sustainable, make our existence sustainable, because there have been very active and strategic measures to make sure that it's not. My team, I've got them into the habit of saying, this is how we show that Black lives matter. Everyone loves to say Black lives matter after a Black person, a Black unarmed male, is gunned down in the street like a dog. That's not the time to say that Black lives matter. 7:48 p.m. on May 13th is the moment that we have to say Black lives matter, because that's when we're living our Black life. Right now, this is it. So this is how I show my catharsis, by sharing these things, by presenting strategy, by presenting a path. I developed Urban Legacy to do this, because we have a media narrative that we have to fight before we even address hardcore on the ground strategy for converting people's lives from a lifestyle of activism to livelihood. Before I can introduce people to STEM, to entrepreneurship and ownership, we have to show them that they are valuable and worth those things, because caste has done an incredibly terrible, horrific job of deifying whiteness. And you might not, if there are white people watching this, you might not feel deified individually, but collectively you absolutely are. We're speaking on a cultural level. We're speaking on the level of a population, and they deify white life and they demonize Black existence. I'm not going to say life because it's existence. We are tolerated. Tolerance. Could you imagine that was the first iteration of anti-racism? Tolerance. You have to tolerate a life that you know you've oppressed, that you know you're not in the past, and not in the distant past, not just your great grandmother, but you're currently exploiting, you're currently underpaying. No, I couldn't stomach a life where I was not in activism with this clear and present danger in mind. Celebrating Black life by showing the last event that we had, we were speaking about Black people in the energy industry. Before that, we were speaking about Black women who are entrepreneurs. For Black History Month, we had politicians come and join us, like State Senate Majority Leader Andrea Stewart Cousins, like Jamal Bowman. We're showing Black excellence on a daily basis because there's a concerted effort being made present day right here in America to show that Black life doesn't matter, regardless of whatever somebody writes on a sign. So it's a part of my burden as well. It's a part of the last question. But since I focus on empowerment, since I focus on elevating Black life as people try to de-escalate our existence, that is my catharsis. That's how we deal with it. And I welcome people to join me. Again, I am not here for conversion. I will not convince you. But if you're excited about a new possibility, my team and I are too, and so are our allies. So is CURE. So is the STEM Alliance. So is Indivisible. So are so many other organizations that want to amplify people who have been artificially, consistently oppressed. That's how I deal with it today.
Thank you, Shane. I'll wait to bring around till Kanan.
So it's always hard to go after Shane.
If it's easier, I do not have to go
But where
first
do you
next
find
time.
hope, Kanan? Where, yeah. I mean, we're all living, I say it a lot to people, if you're not upset, you're living under a rock, and everyone here is not living under a rock. So thank you so much for spending an hour on a Thursday night to choose not to stay under the rock. None of this is easy. And we're all at different places in our life, and none of us are personally, individually responsible, but we each have a personal and individual opportunity to make a difference and to hear and to talk and to listen. And so tonight we're talking and we're listening. And Kanan, how and where do you find hope?
Well, before I can go into hope, I do want to at least bring in something that, just to talk about, I think I would be at a huge miss to not talk about what's going on in India right now with COVID and how the caste system is playing out right now. And so one of the things I did to not just hear about my lived experiences of being an Indian American with the caste system is I actually reached out to relatives in India and family, friends and friends in the US. And it was my first time, actually. It's funny because everyone was like, besides my relatives in India, we're like, no one's ever brought up the caste system to me before. No, we've never spoken about this. And these are friends of mine I've had forever. And most of them, like 90% of them responded, I don't know what caste I am. And then each person saying you should reach out to this person or this person. And when I talked to my family members in India, one of them told me a story about how when they were growing up, they didn't really know much about the caste system because they were told, we don't practice the caste system in our family. And but when they were in med school, they met other Indians from other castes, particularly ones that were Dalits, and how they told them that when I finish med school, I can't go to a village to practice medicine, even though all of these villages so desperately need doctors right now because of their caste. And how right now it kills me to think that there are so many people dying in so many villages in India, and there are so many probably willing doctors who would want to be in those areas who just can't because of their caste. And so that was really kind of heartbreaking to hear. We all know this theoretically, that this happens. It's just, while you're seeing it happen, it's also still very heartbreaking. What gives me hope was that what always gives me hope is my niece, Karen, who's probably listening in. She's an activist in college. The fact that people are having these discussions at a younger age at the dinner table with their parents. There are friends of mine who whose kids are asking them, like, do you believe in this stuff? And there's this kind of pushback from people, including myself now, who's like having these conversations. And yes, definitely late to the game, but we're having these conversations regularly, and we're getting comfortable in our uncomfortableness by, having conversations. I've been having conversations related to race and racism for the last few years, but never about caste or casteism. And now I'm starting to have those conversations with people I've known forever, and we've never brought up anything that was really remotely uncomfortable in our own, views. So I think that gives me hope.
Thank you, Kanan. I mean, yeah, to know people that are talking about it, and everyone here tonight is open to talking about it. So Rhiannon, where do you find hope?
I find I get a lot of hope from having conversations like the ones that we have tonight, as much and as often as possible. And when I was thinking about tonight and what I wanted to say, and when I was preparing for tonight, I actually happened to hear a quote that so perfectly encapsulated how I feel about, or how I came to see my personal place in history, which is actually a source of hope for me, because where I see what my place is and what my responsibility is. And the quote is from an artist that I greatly admire, and he said it in a conversation with President Barack Obama during their joint podcast. And he spoke about one of his songs, Hometown, which is about race in his New Jersey hometown. And Mr. Bruce Springsteen said, I'm going to read it to you. "You are a part of the general flow of history. What is happening and what has happened is partly your responsibility. You're tied in historically to the good and the bad things that happened. As an active player in this moment in time, you have some power to do something about them in some small way." So everything that came before me and everything that comes after me, I am tied in my small way into that. And I've come to take my role as an active player in this moment very seriously. And in this country that I chose as my home, and this community that I'm so entangled in, and as a mom of 3 children, it gives me hope and comfort to know that in my small way, I can create change through my consistent and daily activism. And on a daily basis, I can try to learn how to be an ally. I can learn how to be an ally to Shane. I can learn how to be an ally to Kanan. And I can try my very best to raise 3 more allies. So I think that's where I see my place in history, and I draw hope from that.
I'd love us all to just take a collective deep breath again, because this has been a lot. I know for me, as someone who's thinks about this a lot, and I know, but if everyone can just put your feet on the floor, put your hands on your lap, and literally just take the deepest breath you've taken all day, and just let it out. Thank you so much to each of you, Shane and Kanan and Rhiannon, and your clarity, your wisdom, your experience, your vulnerability, and helping us to understand the way that our culture and our world systems work to harm and to elevate certain people. And I think we all just want to consider, you know, where we are personally and what we have to learn. Again, going inside, and then going outside, to all of your points about like, what small thing, get to know that neighbor who looks different than me, you know, invite someone new to dinner, you know, go to a different restaurant, you know, anything small to move out of our circles of convenience and comfort. And then anything big, like donating to Shane's organization, you know, or I just want to say thank you. It's been an incredible discussion. I really honor each one of you and everyone who joined the call this evening. Please reach out to CURE with any questions. And if you would be willing to stay and fill out a survey, it's always awkward to end these things with a survey. We know that an hour is never long enough, but we intend to continue the conversation, and the survey would help us to understand how to continue in ways that would be helpful and engaging for you. And thank you to all of you for being who you are and for your courage and for your work. If you're willing, it's just about 8 o'clock. It's 8 o'clock, which is amazing. We hit it at 8 o'clock. After the survey, we are going to end with a song that we've ended all of our CURE events with Isabel, the series of Isabel Wilkerson with, by Martin Luther McCoy. It's called The Warmth of Other Suns, which is inspired by her first book, The Warmth of Other Suns, with the City Church of San Francisco. And it's really a profound, just musical offering about the experience of not the dominant class, not the dominant caste. And so we offer that to you. And we thank you so much for joining us tonight. We hope we will see you again.
Stacy, I think I think Nicole wanted us to be available for questions for the next 15 minutes. And I know I don't want people to jump off before they get a chance.
Okay, stay on. Thank you, Kanan.
That's okay.
I missed.
One of you, I think, Nicole, are you gonna check which questions? I don't know. I can't.
Yeah, sorry. We didn't have a ton, so I was like, okay, we can probably wrap it up. But actually, there's a great question in the chat from Damon Marr. How did Germany get to the point of beginning to apologize and grant reparations? Is it a matter of pure factual teaching the Nazi history, or is it more of an appeal to emotion? Is the emotion shame or others? How specific is the teaching about the atrocities that happened? Can America learn to follow such a path 400 years? That's a big question, Damon. But it's interesting because I was thinking something along the lines myself as Rhiannon was speaking at some point of just maybe, Rhiannon, you can answer, when you see where you think America needs to heal, is there a path to that the way Germany did?
Yeah, that is definitely it's so many questions in one, really, that I'm trying to figure out where to begin answering it. When I prepared for this with my mom, she jumped on her computer and sent me, I think, a 10-page document just from her memory, a step-by-step of development of how Germany came to start facing and addressing and dealing with its past. And I could fill a whole nother hour filling in on exactly the steps and the details. I can tell you my mom's experience, and I'll tell you my experience when it came to learning about our country's collective dark history. My mom was when she was in high school, her class was the first class, so that was in 1963, the first class whose curriculum included information about World War II, but it was really a lot about the mechanics. It was about this is how the war went down, this is how the Third Reich was structured, things like that. She remembers to this day the shock of when she found out the truth about the persecution of the Jews. And that was several years later when she was already in college. So Germans in the 2 decades after the war, immediately after the war, were very focused on survival because Germany was destroyed, and there was no food. My mom, all my mom remembers was being extremely hungry all the time, and so and they were very focused on rebuilding. They were obviously split into four by the Allied forces, and what my mom says was that the facing of what happened was much more advanced, obviously, in the American and the British parts of Germany. So it took several decades, although there were obviously the Nuremberg trials happened right away, some reparations started right away. But for the general German population, the actual grappling with the dark chapters of what had happened didn't start until decades later. Now fast forward to when I was a student, when I was in high school, which was in the 90s. I remember learning about the Holocaust at every age level, starting when I was very, very young in elementary school. And I think the main answer to Damon's question is, how can America follow suit and start down a path where we really do face our truth? Is just that we start really, really young, and we make sure that our children at the youngest age learn exactly what happened, and we're not going to spare them any of the dark details, because this is all ingrained in all of us. And the earlier we start the conversation and the dialogue with our children, the better chance we have, I think, in moving forward, and like I said earlier, raising allies who want to be part of a solution. That's a very simple answer for a very complex question. I could go on, but I think, yeah, Shane, go ahead.
No, I want to mirror something that somebody said actually earlier about the Israeli-Palestinian conflict. When everyone says it's like a complicated subject or anything like that, it's actually very simple. We complicate it because different people have, I know you understand this, Rhiannon, because you do the work every day, but so many people don't understand. It's very simple and direct what to do unless you have a stake or a share in the profit of oppression. It's very clear what to do about these things. I'll give you a perfect example. Here in America, actually a conversation that goes on amongst Black families, besides the inevitable talk and things that we've exposed to the world, we are very aware that right here in the United States, there used to be actually a postal system of lynching photos being shared among white families across the nation. Let's not deep south this. And in many of those photos, directly under the victim would be people with their families, very small children. And it's very interesting to know that and to have seen those pictures and grown up with that experience. But at the same time, you have the Daughters of the Confederacy who have shaped our textbooks in school so drastically that most white children even are not learning about what the situation is on a daily basis. And I've always wondered, if those lynching photos came out of the 60s and those people were children, where are they now? There are some culpable individuals, because we try to take it off the individual to make it palatable to even accept this message. And that's why I'm not into conversion. But there are some very individual people who are participants and influence on a larger scale what everyone has access to learning. And that has to end. And that's why we need organizations like CURE who are unashamed and unapologetic about training and reteaching and providing information and learning and discovering and researching what actually happened in this country. How exactly do we get over it? Very specifically, we just voted in a new president, and I hope that that president's cabinet and the Congress and Senate, the congressmen and Senate, I hope they vote in that there needs to be a national scale for national education, especially what's taught with history, because we are still to this day allowing old Southern teachings, old white supremacist and racist teachings to be in our textbooks. The slaves were happy. At least they were all employed and all housed and all clothed, which is a lie. Could you imagine though? Black people were immigrants. When? Where? Who? This is what's being taught in schools today. And people make the excuse, well, oh, well, they're children, they don't need to be exposed to, so you're exposing them to lies and that's okay. And then when did that standard start? Because again, I saw those children in those lynching photos, smiling just as broadly as their fathers did when they murdered us and their mothers. So we just need to be, this is not a complicated situation. We need some very clear legislation around it. And individually, just as much as there are individual people that are culpable for it, we need to be individually responsible for learning exactly what happened in American history. I am not responsible as a Black male for teaching white people about white supremacy. We all need to individually take that responsibility on ourselves.
And I'll just add to that, Shane, you know, it's so easy to think of the people in Washington, but we have a great school district who doesn't teach full history. You know, and I'm going on a limb as, you know, a parent in the district, involved, whatever. There's a lot that needs to change. And each one of us who lives in this district, child or no child, has a voice. So, you know, and that's where your power can be used to make change. There's a Board of Education election coming up. If you live in this district, find out about the candidates and vote. You know, it's not about,
in our
I'm
first
sorry.
event, I actually asked Shelley Mayer, because she's one of the she's the chairman of the education committee on the state level. I said, well, what are we doing exactly to teach not only a more functional curriculum, a more STEM-based curriculum, so we could compete in the economy of 2021, but what are we doing to instill a full picture of history in our schools? And could you imagine there's pushback against that? I wonder why and from whom.
And I think so often it's the people immediately feel blame. It's like, get over yourself. It's not about blame. It's about making change, you know, like, and it's also how
this is an opportunity.
It's an opportunity. And if we can also, you know, ask for change in that way, not ask, but expect, you know, it's an opportunity, but it takes a lot of voices to make a lot of change. And if we could start in our district and in New Rochelle, and, you know, it doesn't start in Washington. And I think we all as activists understand that. And that means every person on this call has power to initiate that change.
I think it's about learning and teaching to sit with uncomfortable feelings, shame and guilt and helplessness, and you know, all those feelings. You know, I think especially in America, we're all kind of always being trained to push uncomfortable feelings away or overcome them or move beyond them. But I think you got to sit with them, and you got to sit in it, you got to stir in it, and you are going, you know, you just have to learn how to turn that into positive action. You know, I think that's what Germans have been doing that Americans have not been doing. This confronting and facing it, sitting with it, letting you feel how bad that feels, but then what comes next? You know, I'm talking in very general terms. Obviously, not all Germans are that, and we're now seeing that Germany is back to a point where, you know, a lot of these mistakes are starting to happen and being repeated. You know, that not even a century after after the World War. But I think that the more you teach and the more you learn to sit with uncomfortable feelings and learn how to turn them into action, the more of a chance you have to move forward.
Yeah, I think the rise of nationalism and identity politics is becoming universal throughout the world right now, and so there's so many places that we're watching for that type of issue and the otherisms that's occurring. But one of the things that I find interesting with when I was talking to my husband, who's white, about caste is that an Indian who's a Brahmin may think he's a Brahmin and is powerful in India and maybe in some parts of America and wherever there's lots of Indians, so in UK, but within the Indian community. But a white person can go anywhere and think that they're in positions of power. And I think that is just more, it's a global, it's a global issue with how white people view themselves as being on top versus the difference in when I look at the caste system.
Thank you. In response to that, and again, I'm taking too many personal notes, but as a member of the white dominant caste, I've struggled a lot in my journey with cure and education with just the weight of guilt and shame that I wasn't even aware of, and how, and that's part of the process. And I'm not through it. I'm never going to be through it, though I've never been in, I benefit like I just do. And sitting with that is not easy, but sitting with it with others helps. And then as you guys have all, amazing adults have said, turning it into some sort of action is also incredibly healing. And saying, it in some degree, it stops with me, or some degree of change is going to start with me, and there are so many opportunities to do that. And we as Cure want to be a conduit for that, for people. And so any ideas that anyone on this call has to offer us, we'd be really happy to hear. Again, we're not, as an organization, activists, but we're here to educate and learn so that we can be activists. And we partner with anyone and everyone who's doing that in an authentic way. So I don't know, Nicole, if there's any other questions that you wanted to address from the chat.
No, I think we're good. We're so grateful for everyone's time this evening, and I'm just going to leave us with, especially, I'm sorry, Rhiannon, Shane, and Kanan. You're just incredible, brilliant, generous, courageous, and we're watching your good work every day. And go to urbanlegacy.org, is it, Shane? And make a donation for Black entrepreneurs and STEM work. So I'm going to play a video by Martin Luther McCoy. It was a song written called The Warmth of Other Suns, inspired by Isabel Wilkerson's book. And the City Orchestra of San Francisco is playing along with him. Thank you so much for being here this evening. We're always grateful for you.
We are aware of your fear and exhausted from having to hide who we are. Pretending that we're less won't make you stronger in the end. We suffer from black pain for white gain. Crack laws versus cocaine. You don't consider all the horror that we've been through till we force a new horizon to come in view. Funny how you fashion yourself the hero. Deconstruction of the Negro. Oh, maybe we'll find our light in the warmth of others. mind control that tolls the soul by trolling each and every part of me. I just want to be free to suffer from black pain for white gain, crack laws versus cocaine. You don't consider it